Hello and welcome back to All Things Money. I'm your host, David Blain. Thank you for joining us today in this third and final segment of today's show. We've been talking mostly today about the economic landscape, what's going on out there with, of course, as I divert into these sidebars associated with it, but most of the show I've been talking about the economic data, what's happening out there with different statistics, inflation, retail sales, the market, things like that. If you missed the first couple segments, please head on over to our website, dlblain.com. There you'll find archived copies of the show. You can kind of catch up. But the point of it is, every month there's all this economic data that comes out, and that's what we're talking about today. But yet, at the end of the day, it's nice to look at, it's nice to read, maybe try to understand some of it. But in terms of your portfolio construction, my point in going over this is just the volatility of the data itself, that the effect on your portfolio should be nothing. The fact that retail sales went up or down last month should not affect what you do in your portfolio. I'm just giving this information to try to put it in perspective of where, when you hear this information, what do you do with it? I would postulate that you shouldn't do anything with it, that these short-term month-to-month numbers really don't have any effect on your portfolio. When we last left last segment, we were talking a little bit about inflation versus price increase. And a lot of people think that inflation is the same thing as an increase in the CPI. And they are definitely related, but if you look at pure inflation, inflation really relates to the money supply, and when you have too many dollars chasing too few goods, you have inflation. And so my point is that you can have a rise in demand for an item and the price of it will go up. You could have a supply drop and the price will go up. Likewise, you could have a supply increase. Let's just take oil. If all of a sudden the supply of oil was constricted, the price of oil would go up. It's not necessarily the same thing as inflation. When we talk about inflation, we're talking about a wholesale, across the board increase in the level of prices due to too much money in the economy chasing too few goods. And so that's why you can have inflation remaining low as it is, but yet food and gas prices going up, because they're very related, but they're not exactly the same. Just something to keep in mind. Maybe we'll do another show on that. I did one, I don't know, it's probably been a couple of years now, but it's a subtle but very distinct difference between inflation and the price of something going up. All right, so we saw industrial production slow down a little bit in July. It was unchanged in July. The 2.1% decrease in utility was offset by a 2.1% increase in mining production. We have seen some good resurgence of manufacturing and industrial production in the U.S. Now, don't get me wrong, we're not going to overnight replace China and Southeast Asia as sort of the world's manufacturing floor, but we are seeing some resurgence in manufacturing as those economies over there remain weak. We see that their population sort of rising into middle class, demanding higher wages, more benefits, better living conditions, things like that have long made their labor very cheap. Well, we're seeing some of those very gradually. Like I said, it's not overnight, but we're seeing some of those advantages start to erode, and people are taking a look at the United States again, especially after this global crisis, seeing the strength of the U.S., and we are seeing some resurgence in manufacturing in the U.S. And I think that's important for the future as we continue to rebuild the economy, looking at things. Now, we don't want to have things here, just make them here for the sake of making them here if it is not a good business practice. But I think we're seeing by reducing some of the outlandish perks and benefits and things like that of certain industries and cutting costs where appropriate, taking care of people, we see that manufacturing can succeed again here in the United States. After years of dominating the world in manufacturing, people started looking overseas simply because of the labor cost. And when it became cheaper to ship something halfway around the world, have it manufactured there and shipped back, and then distributed across the U.S. than it was to make something in your backyard, well, people did that. And we're seeing is some of that advantage is slowly eroding away as these countries in Southeast Asia have to modernize. The people are demanding more wages. The international community is putting pressure. You can't just dump the raw sewage into the rivers. The U.S. manufacturers and to a great extent European manufacturers have a lot more environmental regulations. Now, I'm not a big advocate for over-regulating, but certainly dumping raw sewage into a river or water that is at the boiling point that you used in some sort of manufacturing process, dumping that straight into some river is not a good idea. Well, that's what a lot of these countries have done. And as their regulations start to catch up, the cost of doing business over there rises, and it makes the marketplace more globally competitive. And so we're seeing some of these changes take place. Back on the business productivity increased 0.9% for the second quarter, while labor costs rose 1.4% for the same period. There was a 1.7% decline in productivity in the first quarter. And if you look at economic growth sort of in general, you can increase your economic growth by aggregate output. You can produce more goods and services, which typically in the traditional sense would mean more people. You add more people to the labor force. The other way you increase the GDP and growth of a country is by increasing the productivity. So if you have 50 workers, you can either add 100 workers and create twice as many goods, or you can keep the same 50 workers and employ some sort of modern techniques to increase the productivity. So it's something that we look at over long periods of time is the productivity. We saw that housing starts increased 5.9% in July, which is a good sign, and almost a 900,000 annualized rate in housing starts, an increase of 50,000 from June and 20% over the prior year. So we do see some good signs of continuing growth, but just remember these numbers are very volatile and you don't want to make wholesale changes to your portfolio based on them. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you again next week.
The proceeding was a paid program. The opinions expressed are not necessarily those of WNBU and Inner Banks Media.